She walked into a courtroom to defend a stranger, and realized too late that the stranger was the man who had destroyed her entire life. The first frost of November had arrived in Chicago without warning, the way all painful things do, quietly, and all at once. Nora Callahan stood on the cracked sidewalk outside the Cook County Courthouse, her breath fogging in the gray morning air. She was 34 years old, a public defender with 11 years of fighting for people the world had already given up on. She wore her mother's old navy peacoat, scuffed boots, and the kind of silence that comes from a woman who has learned to carry grief without letting it show. She had nothing glamorous. No corner office. No designer bag. Just a battered leather satchel stuffed with case files and a thermos of black coffee that had gone cold somewhere between the L train and the courthouse steps. But Nora Callahan had a voice. Not a voice that had ever been on television or recorded in a studio. A voice that had talked frightened teenagers off ledges in holding cells. A voice that had whispered comfort to mothers in tears. A voice that could walk into a room full of doubt and make a jury feel the weight of someone else's truth like it was their own. That voice was the only thing she had ever truly trusted. And today, someone was trying to take it from her. 3 weeks earlier, a sealed envelope had been slipped under the door of her office at 11:47 p.m. She still hadn't told anyone what was inside it. She pushed through the heavy courthouse doors, nodding to the security guard, Frank, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s who always had a peppermint in his pocket and a kind word ready. He gave her a look today, not his usual cheerful nod, but something heavier. Something that said he had seen the morning news. Nora kept walking. The hallway of the courthouse smelled like pine cleaner and old paper and the faint metallic edge of anxiety. She had loved that smell once. It had meant purpose. Today it felt like the air before a storm. She ducked into the small attorney's prep room at the end of the hall, set her satchel on the table, and finally allowed herself 30 seconds of stillness. She pressed her palms flat on the cold metal table. She breathed. On her phone, the notifications had stopped coming in the hundreds and started arriving in the thousands. Corrupt defender Nora Callahan took bribe to lose the Hargrove case. Cook County's most dangerous lawyer, she lets killers walk. Public defender or private fixer? The truth about Nora Callahan. The headline that hurt the most came from a blog run by a man named Dex Rutherford, a former journalist turned online provocateur with 4.2 million followers. He had posted a video, a conversation, allegedly recorded in a parking garage, in which a woman with Nora's exact vocal cadence agreed to throw a case in exchange for $30,000. Nora had never been in that parking garage. She had never spoken those words. She had never taken a single dollar she hadn't earned. But the internet didn't need proof. It only needed a story that felt true enough to share. She had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Her clients, frightened, vulnerable, innocent people, had been reassigned to overworked strangers. The Illinois bar had opened a preliminary inquiry. 2 of her closest colleagues had stopped returning her texts. And still, impossibly, she had come to court today. Because today's case was not hers. It had been assigned to her at the very last moment, just before the leave was enforced, a loophole her supervisor had reluctantly acknowledged. And the defendant was a man she had never met. His name was on the file. She hadn't looked at it yet. What Nora didn't know, what nobody in that building knew yet, was that the defendant she was about to represent was the only living person who could either completely destroy her, or set her free. She opened the manila folder. The name at the top of the page hit her like cold water to the face. Defendant, Marcus Ellery Voss. The thermos slipped from her fingers and clattered against the floor, coffee pooling black across the linoleum. Marcus Voss. She knew that name. She had known it for 6 years. She had whispered it into her pillow during nights she wasn't proud of. She had written it in the corner of a legal pad once and then torn the page to pieces and thrown it into the river. Marcus Boss was the man who had testified against her brother. 6 years ago, her younger brother Danny, 22 years old, kind-eyed, a community college student who fixed bicycles in the neighborhood for spare cash, had been convicted of aggravated assault based almost entirely on the eyewitness testimony of one Marcus Boss. Danny had served 4 years of a 7-year sentence. He had come home quieter, smaller, like someone had reached into his chest and removed something essential. Nora had spent those 4 years building her career, fighting for others, trying to make meaning out of the helplessness she felt about Danny. She had never been able to prove Voss had lied. She had never been able to prove the coercion she suspected. She had lived with that failure like a stone in her shoe. And now Marcus Voss was sitting in a holding cell 20 yards from where she stood, charged with aggravated fraud, and she was his lawyer. She almost walked out. She had her hand on the door handle. What stopped her was something she had not expected, a sound coming from the other side of the wall, low and broken, like a man weeping alone. Nora stood frozen for a long moment. Every ethical instinct she had ever trained screamed at her to disclose the conflict of interest. To walk to her supervisor's office. To hand the file back and remove herself from the case with a clean conscience. But her hand didn't move from the folder. Because there was something else in that file. A single supplementary document, stapled to the back, that she nearly missed. A letter from the defendant to the court, handwritten on lined paper in a shaking script. I know what I did 6 years ago was wrong. I know the truth about Nora Callahan. I have been living with it every day since. I am ready to speak, but only if someone will actually listen. I am asking for a public defender. I am asking for Nora Callahan specifically. I know she has every reason to hate me. I am hoping that means she is the only one who will believe me when I tell her what really happened. The room felt like it had tilted. Nora read the letter 3 times. Then she picked up her coffee thermos from the floor, wiped it clean with the hem of her coat, and walked toward the holding cells. The holding cell corridor was fluorescent and humming. The guard buzzed her through without comment. She walked to the 3rd cell on the left. Marcus Voss was not what she had imagined for 6 years. She had built him into something monstrous in the architecture of her grief, a cold, calculating man with dead eyes and a rehearsed smirk. The person sitting on the bench with his hands clasped between his knees was thin in a way that looked like illness, not choice. His hair had gone gray at the temples. He had the look of a man who hadn't slept through a full night in years. When he looked up and saw her, something crossed his face that she hadn't expected either. Relief. Pure, trembling, exhausted relief. Miss Callahan, he said, his voice rough. You actually came. I'm your attorney, Nora said, keeping her voice carefully neutral. That's all I am right now. Don't mistake it for anything else. He nodded quickly, like a man who had accepted far worse terms than that. Tell me about the fraud charge, she said, setting her legal pad on the bench beside her. It's fabricated, he said. The same people who paid me to lie about your brother 6 years ago. They needed me quiet then. They need me gone now. He said the same people. Nora wrote it down. She underlined it twice. She did not yet know that those 2 words were about to crack open a conspiracy that went all the way to the 4th floor of that very courthouse. Who paid you? Nora asked, her pen hovering. Marcus exhaled slowly, like a man releasing a breath he had been holding for years. A man named Gerald Ashford, he said. He was a developer. He needed the vacant lot on Keller Street cleared of its community lease. Nora Callahan was the organizer. He kept the neighborhood together, kept the lease alive. Ashford needed him gone. Needed him discredited. I was 26 years old, I owed Ashford money, and I was terrified. Nora's hand was very still on the legal pad. Ashford is dead, she said quietly. He died 2 years ago. His partners aren't, Marcus said. And one of them is a sitting circuit court judge. The fluorescent light above them flickered once, then steadied. Nora looked at the man across from her, the man she had quietly hated for 6 years, and saw something she hadn't allowed herself to see before. She saw a human being who had made a terrible choice at his most frightened, and had been paying for it in silence ever since. She didn't forgive him. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. But she believed him. And in her world, belief was the first act of justice. What Nora didn't know yet was that Gerald Ashford's former partner, the judge Marcus had just named, was scheduled to preside over this very case. His name was on the docket sheet in her satchel. She hadn't read that far. She walked back to the prep room and pulled out the docket sheet. The presiding judge for the case of State of Illinois versus Marcus Ellery Voss was the Honorable Raymond T. Caldwell. Nora sat down very slowly. She had appeared before Judge Caldwell 11 times in her career. He had always been courteous to her. Professional. He had once complimented her closing argument in front of the entire courtroom. She thought about the sealed envelope that had been slipped under her office door 3 weeks ago. She had opened it alone, at midnight, and read it once, and then locked it in the false bottom of her desk drawer, because she hadn't known what to do with what it said. The envelope had contained a single page, a photograph of 2 men at a restaurant, dated 6 years ago. One of them was Gerald Ashford. The other was Raymond Caldwell. Written on the back in red ink were 4 words. He was there too. Someone had sent her that envelope. Someone who knew. Someone who had been watching this entire thing from a distance, waiting for the right moment. Nora had spent 3 weeks trying to figure out who. She was about to find out in the most unexpected way possible. The courtroom filled quietly on that gray November morning. Nora took her place at the defense table, her materials arranged with the precise, unhurried calm she projected in every courtroom, regardless of what was happening inside her chest. Marcus sat beside her in a pressed shirt that looked borrowed. He kept his hands flat on the table, still as a man who had learned stillness the hard way. Judge Caldwell entered to the customary all rise, his black robe moving like a shadow across the front of the room. He looked at Nora. She looked at him. Neither of them gave anything away. The prosecution opened with what they had: digital records, bank statements, a paper trail that looked damning until you understood who had built it and why. Nora took careful notes. She asked precise questions. She was a surgeon this morning, not a fighter. But during the lunch recess, something happened that changed everything. A woman slid into the seat beside Nora in the corridor outside the courtroom, a woman she had never seen before. Mid-50s, silver hair pulled back tightly, wearing a gray wool blazer and the expression of someone who had been waiting a very long time. "My name is Judith Crane," the woman said quietly. "I was Gerald Ashford's private accountant for 14 years. I sent you the envelope." Judith Crane. The woman who had been watching from a distance. The woman who had sent the photograph. She had waited 3 weeks to reveal herself, because she needed to be sure that Nora was the kind of person who would use what she gave her correctly, not for revenge, but for truth. Nora didn't move. She kept her voice to a whisper. "Why now?" "Because Marcus finally talked," Judith said. "And because I have the wire transfers. All of them. Including the ones to Caldwell's private account, routed through a real estate holding company in Delaware. I've had them for 4 years. I was afraid." She paused. "I'm not afraid anymore." She pressed a small USB drive into Nora's hand. "I have a copy in 3 other places," Judith said. "In case anything happens to either of us." Then she stood and walked away down the corridor without looking back. Nora sat alone for a moment, the USB drive warm in her palm. She thought about Danny. About the 4 years. About the bicycle shop he'd tried to open when he got out, and the way he couldn't quite look customers in the eye anymore, and the way he flinched sometimes at loud sounds, and how he never talked about what those years had done to him because he didn't have the words and she didn't have the courage to ask. She thought about her own voice, the one being dismantled online, the one calling her corrupt and dangerous and dishonest. She thought about what it meant to speak when no one wanted to listen. And then she straightened her back, picked up her satchel, and walked back into the courtroom. What happened next would be written about in the Chicago Tribune, the National Law Review, and eventually, 3 years later, in a book about judicial accountability that would be assigned in law schools across the country. But none of those accounts would capture what it actually felt like to be in that room. Nora didn't shout. She didn't perform. She simply told the truth, methodically and completely, the way you take apart a wall brick by brick until the light finally gets through. She filed an emergency motion citing newly discovered evidence of judicial conflict of interest. She named Caldwell directly, calmly, looking at him as she spoke. She placed the documented financial connection between Caldwell and Ashford into the court record. She requested an immediate transfer of the case to a conflict-free bench and the preservation of all related financial records. The courtroom went completely still. Caldwell's face did something complicated. It cycled through authority and contempt and then, finally, a flicker of something that looked almost like the specific exhaustion of a man whose long secret has finally been spoken aloud by someone who will not be stopped. He called a recess. He did not come back. By 4 p.m. that afternoon, the Illinois Attorney General's office had opened a formal investigation. By the following morning, Raymond Caldwell had submitted his resignation from the bench, citing personal health reasons, a statement that fooled no one. The fraud charges against Marcus Voss were dismissed pending review of prosecutorial conduct. And in a small but significant addendum, almost buried in the legal paperwork, but not buried to the people it mattered to, the Cook County State's Attorney's Office announced that it was opening a review of the 6-year-old conviction of one Daniel Thomas Callahan, in light of newly submitted evidence of witness coercion. The judge whose name had been on the docket, the same man who had once complimented Nora's closing argument, the man who had sat across the courtroom from her 11 times while carrying the weight of what he had done, was gone. And the case that had been designed to crush Marcus Voss had instead become the crack that broke the entire structure open. Nora walked out of the courthouse at 5:17 p.m. into the blue cold of a Chicago evening. She stood on the steps for a long moment, not moving, the way you stand when something enormous has shifted and you haven't quite caught up to it yet. Her phone was ringing. She didn't answer it. Then it buzzed with a text message. One she had been waiting 6 years to receive, though she hadn't known to call it that until this moment. It was from Danny. I heard. Call me when you can. I love you, Nora. She pressed the phone against her chest and let herself cry, just for 30 seconds, right there on the courthouse steps in the cold, where anyone could see her. She didn't care. The same people. 2 words Marcus had spoken in the holding cell that morning. 2 words that had opened a door into a 6-year-old darkness. The conspiracy had reached the 4th floor of that courthouse, and it had been dismantled not by power or money or political maneuvering, but by 3 people who had finally decided that being silent was more dangerous than speaking. 2 weeks later, the online conversation had not fully reversed. The internet rarely offers clean apologies. There were still pockets of hostility, still people who had made up their minds and found it too uncomfortable to unmake them. But something had shifted in the tide. A retired federal judge wrote a long piece in the Tribune about Nora's conduct in the courtroom that day, calling it among the most precise and courageous pieces of legal advocacy he had seen in 40 years of practice. Several of her former clients posted their own accounts, quiet, unpolished, honest, about what Nora Callahan had actually done for them. Not the televised version of justice. The real kind, in fluorescent-lit rooms at 7 in the morning, when no one was watching. The Illinois bar cleared her of all misconduct charges. Her administrative leave ended. She went back to work on a Tuesday. Frank the security guard had a peppermint waiting for her at the front desk. She took it without a word and put it in her coat pocket and walked to her office. On her desk was a handwritten card. She didn't recognize the handwriting at first. Then she looked at the signature. Marcus Boss. She opened it. I don't know how to say what I want to say in a way that is enough. Maybe there is no way that is enough. But I want you to know that I told the truth because of you, not because you forgave me, and not because you were kind to me, but because you came into that cell and you listened. You listened like my words mattered before you knew whether they were useful to you. I have spent 6 years around people who only listen for what they can use. I had forgotten that kind of listening existed. Thank you for reminding me. MB. Nora sat with the card for a long time. Then she filed it in the front pocket of her leather satchel, right behind the photo of Danny from before the conviction, the one where he was laughing at something off camera, his eyes fully open, his face belonging entirely to himself. The sound she had heard through the wall of the prep room that morning, low and broken, like a man weeping alone, had been Marcus. He had been sitting in that holding cell, completely certain that she would read his name and walk away. He had been crying not from self-pity, but from the specific grief of a man who has held a truth too long and doesn't know if he has the right to release it. She had not walked away. That choice, made in a single unguarded moment, had changed everything. On a cold Saturday in December, 3 weeks after the courthouse, Nora drove to Danny's apartment on the west side of the city. He lived in a ground-floor unit in a beige brick building with a small window box where he grew herbs in the summer, basil and mint and a stubborn rosemary that somehow survived Chicago winters. Today the box was empty and frost-edged, waiting. Danny opened the door before she knocked. He had been watching for her car. He was 30 years old. He was her little brother. He looked like himself again, more than he had in years, and she didn't know if that was the news about the case review or just the particular alchemy of time and survival. They stood in the doorway for a second, both of them doing the math of the years between them without saying it out loud. Then he pulled her into a hug so tight it displaced the air from her lungs, and she let it, and she pressed her face into his shoulder like she was 5 years old again and he was the one who needed protecting even then. You didn't have to do it this way, he murmured into her hair. I know, she said. You could have just, I don't know. Lived your life. Let it go. I know, she said again. Why didn't you? She pulled back and looked at him, at the particular brown of his eyes that was exactly like their mother's, at the small scar above his lip from the bike accident when he was 9, at all the years she had been carrying guilt for not being able to stop what happened to him. Because your voice matters, she said. And someone had to say so out loud. Danny blinked. He pressed his lips together the way he did when he was trying not to cry, a habit he'd had since childhood. He looked down at the floor. Then he nodded, once, slowly, like a man receiving something he hadn't known he needed. Come inside, he said. I made chili. She followed him in. The apartment smelled like cumin and something warm and old, like the kitchen of the house they'd grown up in on Maple Street in Evanston. He had their mother's cast iron pot on the stove, the one with the cracked handle they'd refused to throw away. The radio was playing something low and jazzy from the 40s. They sat at a small kitchen table and ate chili with cornbread and didn't talk about the courthouse or the conviction or the investigation or the news. They talked about the herb box and whether rosemary could really survive another Chicago winter. They talked about the movie they'd both separately watched on streaming and both separately been annoyed by. They talked about their father's birthday coming up in February and whether they should drive to Evanston together this year. Normal things. Ordinary things. The kind of things that are only possible when the extraordinary weight has been, at least partially, set down. Marcus Boss had been the only person who could destroy Nora or set her free. In the end, he had done neither, and both. He had not given her back her reputation on his own. He had given her something harder to find and more permanent, the evidence of a truth she had always known, finally made provable. And in the process, he had freed himself from the heaviest thing a person can carry, a lie they've worn so long it starts to feel like skin. Spring came to Chicago the way it always does, reluctantly, in fits and starts, with cold snaps in April that feel like betrayals, and then one morning in May when you walk outside and the air is different and you remember why you stayed. Nora was back in court. Back fully, officially, completely. Her caseload was heavy, as it had always been. She was working a wrongful eviction, a juvenile assault case she had strong feelings about, and a custody matter that kept her up at night for reasons she couldn't fully articulate. She was on the courthouse steps when her phone rang. A number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. Then she did. "Miss Callahan?" A young woman's voice. Careful. Slightly breathless. "Yes. My name is Petra. I'm a first year at Northwestern Law. I've been following your case. I've read everything I could find about what happened with Judge Caldwell and the Boss case and your brother's review." A pause. "I'm calling because I want to be a public defender. And I need to know, how you walked into that courtroom that day. How you did it when everything was already against you. How you used your voice when you knew the whole world was trying to take it away." Nora stood on the courthouse steps in the May sunlight, her satchel on her shoulder, her coffee already cold. She thought about a sealed envelope slipped under a door at midnight. She thought about a man weeping alone through a wall. She thought about a USB drive pressed into her palm by a woman who had stopped being afraid. She thought about Danny's face in the doorway, and the cast iron pot, and the rosemary that somehow survived the winter. She thought about what it means to speak when the world is very loud and your truth is very quiet. "You do it scared," Nora said. "You do it imperfectly. You do it because the alternative, staying silent, letting the lie win, is the one thing you absolutely cannot live with." She paused. "And you find the people who are willing to tell the truth alongside you. Because no one does it alone." "Not really." A long silence on the other end of the line. "Okay," Petra said softly. "Okay. Are you at the law school right now?" Nora asked. "Yes. I have 30 minutes before my next client meeting. If you can get to the Daily Center by noon, I'll buy you a bad cup of coffee and we can talk." Another pause. And then, clear and young and full of something that sounded like the beginning of a long, important thing, "I'll be there." Nora hung up. She walked down the steps. Above her, the Chicago sky was blue in the way it only gets in May, a deep, specific blue that feels like a promise the city is making to itself. 3 weeks before any of this began, a sealed envelope had been slipped under Nora's office door at 11:47 p.m. She had opened it alone and read the photograph inside, 2 men at a restaurant, 6 years ago, the handwritten words on the back, and she had locked it away because she hadn't known what to do with it yet. She had been waiting to understand what kind of person she was going to be. The answer, it turned out, was the kind who walks into the courtroom anyway. The kind who picks up her old leather satchel and goes. The kind who buys a first-year law student a bad cup of coffee and tells her the truth about what it costs to speak, and why it is always, always worth it. Daniel Thomas Callahan's conviction was formally vacated on a Thursday in June, 8 months after Nora walked into that courtroom. There was no ceremony. The law rarely offers ceremony for its corrections. There was a document, a filing, a judge's signature, a date stamp. Danny was at work when Nora called him. He was a manager now at a neighborhood hardware store, the kind of place with wooden floors and a bell above the door. He had started a mentorship program there for teenagers on probation, teaching them how to fix things with their hands, how to make something broken work again. He picked up on the second ring. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. Is it done? It's done. The line was quiet for a moment. Not an empty silence. A full one. You know what I'm going to do right now? Danny said. What? Go out back and plant the rosemary. It's warm enough. Nora laughed. It surprised her, how free the laugh was, how it came from somewhere she'd thought might have dried up. That's a good plan, she said. You should come over this weekend. Help me with the window box. I will, she said. And she meant it. True power does not live in courtrooms or corner offices or the roar of a crowd online. It lives in the moment a frightened person decides to tell the truth anyway, in the quiet, deliberate act of using your voice not to perform, but to protect. Not to win, but to restore. Nora Callahan never became a household name. She never wanted to be. She became something rarer, a person her brother could call on a Thursday afternoon knowing she would answer. A person a first-year law student could find on the courthouse steps and be told the truth. A person whose voice, at its most powerful, never sounded like power at all. It sounded like someone simply refusing to be quiet when silence would be the greater cruelty. That is the voice worth having. That is the voice worth fighting for.